in anticipation of, at least one new drug approval, new drug application to the FDA for psychedelic assisted therapy treatment, we, APPA and BrainFutures, convened a work group of expert researchers and clinicians to develop these guidelines for psychedelic-assisted therapy. And until then, or really until we published them last month, there was no comprehensive, universally accepted set of guidelines for mental health providers practicing psychedelic-assisted therapy. And now we have one. And what they do is they provide general recommendations for practitioners to increase their awareness and knowledge and skills.
Hadas, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's been a while since we've had you here as a guest on the Psychedelic Spotlight podcast, so really happy to see you. It's been a while since we last chatted, so I'm curious, how's life been treating you?
It's nice to be here again. Thank you for having me. Life's been treating me great. I'm super tired and busy, but it's like a very happy tired and, end of the day feeling fulfilled, feeling like there's a lot of work that we've got to do, but we're getting it done. So it's great.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I was speaking with a colleague of mine recently, and I was mentioning that, you'd be hard pressed to find a professional out there who dedicates more time, energy, effort, knowledge, and expertise as you do here to this emerging field of psychedelic assisted therapy, whether it was through, previous work involved, as a founding partner of the Plant Medicine Law Group, or with what you were doing now here as the Director of Government Affairs for the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association, the APPA, which we're going to get into here. You really are at the forefront of a lot of what's happening here in terms of the landscape that's being developed for policies and all of that here with the psychedelic space. So it's got to be a lot of work, but also exciting. So want to jump right in. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your role here with the APPA and specifically what the organization focuses on, I think that'd be a great starting point for us.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Government Affairs, meaning that I'm laser focused on making sure that practitioners, our members, have a seat at the table and a voice in the conversation as we approach FDA approval. So I think, what makes clinical care strong is that practitioners have the authority to make decisions based on their clinical judgment, their training, and their experience. So our professional practice guidelines, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later, define psychedelic-assisted therapy as a particular mode of using psychedelic substances in which the effects of the drug play a significant role in facilitating a psychotherapeutic intervention, meaning that psychotherapy or psychological support is an essential part of how these treatments and therapies get delivered. And we're here as APPA to make sure that practitioners are trained to do that, and they have the best possible resources to do that, to guide their decision-making, and that they have the ability to do that in a way that supports the best interests of their patients.
Yeah, and so I want to talk a little bit about, the guidelines, as I know that, you helped spearheaded here recently the publishing of the first psychedelic assisted therapy practice guidelines. And you did this in collaboration, of course, with BrainFutures. And so I want to talk a little bit about the importance of that, because I think what gets lost on folks who maybe aren't as laser focused as yourself or even myself here in the psychedelic assisted therapy sector is how important practitioner training and guidelines and regulations all are. It's more than just the drugs themselves. So there's a lot more that goes into it. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about the significance of this recent publishing.
Yeah. So in anticipation of, at least one new drug approval, new drug application to the FDA for psychedelic assisted therapy treatment, we, APPA and BrainFutures, convened a work group of expert researchers and clinicians to develop these guidelines for psychedelic-assisted therapy. And until then, or really until we published them last month, there was no comprehensive, universally accepted set of guidelines for mental health providers practicing psychedelic-assisted therapy. And now we have one. And what they do is they provide general recommendations for practitioners to increase their awareness and knowledge and skills. But they also, importantly, for my purposes in my role, they're really helpful for educating people like legislators, regulators, third-party payers like health insurance companies, educators, patients, consumers, as well as just general healthcare providers on what psychedelic-assisted therapy is. And that's really important from a policy and rulemaking and sort of infrastructure development perspective, because everything should come down to, when we're making these high-level decisions, it all affects the patient at the end of the day. And the person in most direct contact with the patient is the practitioner. And so we should be following the practitioner's lead for what best practices are, based on the research, based on the review from the experts. But we also need to make sure that we're supporting practitioners who aren't yet as familiar to understand this is, these are the skills that are required to be proficient.
Yeah, I would imagine that, it's got to be challenging. There's no blueprint, so to speak, for doing all of this. I mean, the field of psychedelic assisted therapy it's so new. I mean, yes, psychedelics have been around for centuries, and of course, utilized by many different indigenous communities and cultures, whether for medicinal or spiritual purposes. But psychedelics within a more medical sort of environment is still something very, very new. So, I mean, how has it been? I mean, just kind of walk me through the challenges that you're facing in terms of writing all of this, really from scratch. I mean, it really is. I mean, you really don't have any, like I said, a blueprint or a guidebook to go look at and say, okay, well, how should this be done? It's really you working with other folks and other individuals to kind of figure it out, right?
Well, so it's an interesting thing, because on the one hand, it is very much a case of first impression for certain actors in this conversation. So when we're talking about FDA, yes, FDA is starting from scratch. And this is, with all due respect to them, they just have never had to deal with a multimodal therapy like this before. So it's a lot of educating and explaining, this is what it is. It's not just psychiatry. It's not just psychology. It's actually both and something else entirely. So there's that piece. And I think the same goes for a lot of the, establishment healthcare and medical organizations and agencies. But from the practitioner perspective and from the researcher perspective and the academic perspective, there's actually this, and the underground practitioner perspective, there's such a wealth of knowledge. And it's really cool. I mean, I think the best part of my job is seeing how much exists and the ways that it's documented and how people give over that knowledge and how we take, the results of an RCT and square it with the anecdotal information that comes out of someone who's been practicing in the underground for 60 years. And all of it contributes to something that does feel very much new, because while all of these things, they've existed for however long they have, indigenous use in separate lanes, the PPGs felt like one of the first times where very formally we were bringing all of it together, which was quite a feat. And I just give a lot of credit to our working groups, because they're the ones that just brought the skills and experience and patience, and created something I think is going to be very useful.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier laying the foundation and the groundwork for policies and regulations. And so I know to help further that objective, APPA recently announced the retaining of the Daschle Group as a governmental affairs council. Daschle Group, of course, has been involved in the cannabis space for several years. So now going to be able to take that experience and potentially apply it here to the emerging field of psychedelic assisted therapy. So talk to me a little bit about the significance of bringing the Daschle Group into all of this.
So, like I said at the beginning, for me, this is really about amplifying practitioner voices
Mhm.
because, there are a lot of different players in this conversation. You've got the drug development companies, you've got pharma, you've got the research institutions, you've got the government agencies. There's so many people, and they all sort of have their home base and their team and their platform and their microphones. And it's really important that practitioners have that too, which is, why we do what we do in large part. And our partnership with the Daschle Group basically just amplifies our ability to give practitioners a voice. So they're helping us, navigate conversations with stakeholders in DC, for example, so we can bring these issues to decision makers in real time while they're having conversations with drug development companies and while they're having conversations with third-party payers. So the practitioner's voice is at the forefront as opposed to being like an add-on at the end.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the practitioners and the important role that they play in all of this, because I don't want to glaze over that. I think there might be some viewers and listeners out there who are hearing the word practitioner, but maybe it's not resonating in terms of what a practitioner specifically is. So I guess let's start there. Can you just give us a quick overview of what specifically a practitioner is when we talk about them in a context within the psychedelic assisted therapy sector?
Well, that's $1 million question. So
Yes.
there's a number of ways to define it, and I think it's really context specific. I would say really broadly, the way APPA defines practitioners in terms of who our members are is it's just self-identified. So anyone who says, I practice the facilitation, monitoring, administration of psychedelic assisted therapy can be a member. The way we define practitioners in the PPGs and the guidelines is slightly different. It's specific in this case to licensed mental health care providers. When we're talking about practitioners at the state level, like in Oregon or Colorado, we're talking about really facilitators who have passed a state training
Right.
on how to sit for sessions. And then there's this whole debate with the FDA right now. So a few months ago in June, they released guidance for the industry for clinical trials using psychedelic drugs. And they solicited feedback and a bunch of people submitted comments, and I've been reviewing all of them, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. But it actually is really, really interesting. And one of the things they're getting the most pushback on is their definition of monitors, because they have a specific set of people they will allow, or the suggested guidance, the draft right now allows to sit for sessions. And what I keep seeing over and over and over in the comments is this shouldn't be about, you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist or you're a certain type of nurse. Really what it should, or, it should be, do you have the requisite training to do the job? And that's really like how I think about it. Is a practitioner is someone who is competent to provide these services in whatever access pathway they practice in. So a practitioner could be an ayahuasquero, a practitioner could be a psychiatrist. It really depends on how they're trained.
Yeah, and I'm curious, from your observations, what challenges do you see practitioners within this space potentially running into that maybe, a traditional psychotherapist may not even have had to ever think twice about? Is there anything in particular that maybe stands out?
Yeah, so I think that I think informed consent is always the first one that comes up, specifically with respect to touch. And there are ways that that people already are navigating that are more or less safe. I think the general standard that's coming out is like, just address everything up front and be really clear on what what situations require some form of physical touch. Like if someone falls on the floor, you have to touch them to help them up, or if they need help walking to the restroom. And what situations is physical touch, non-sexual therapeutic touch, more elective? And then just put it in writing before the session ever starts. I, the patient, consent to non-sexual therapeutic touch, or I don't, and then stick to that. But I think where things get really sticky is people are having these, often the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And they said, they didn't want touch. And then in the middle of the session, they do, but because they no longer have legal capacity to consent, they can't actually go back and modify what they said. So I think that there's really just, there's like the general challenges that arise in social work and nursing and in psychology generally, but there's just more there because of the added element of the psychedelics themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all so important because I know, there's folks out there who think, oh, okay, if we just legalize psychedelic assisted therapy, then, it's just as simple as me going to a clinic and, they administer the therapy. I'm in and out, and that's it. But it's not necessarily that simple. There's so many different moving parts. It's so in depth from a treatment standpoint that I think having to create some of these guidelines is super important. But there are other individuals and folks out there that say that the overcommercialization and trying to really put psychedelic therapy in a box is going to take away from the experience itself. I mean, what are just your own personal thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that maybe there could be too much in terms of regulations and policies? I mean, I know from a lawyer, looking at it with your lawyer hat, an attorney hat, of course, it's important to have these regulations, but understanding just how unique psychedelics are and how unique psychedelic assisted therapy is, do you see where too much regulation might maybe diminish some of the psychedelic experience itself?
Well, I think this is where the fact that we have different access pathways becomes really, really valuable. If someone doesn't want a highly medicalized experience, it seems to be the case that in more and more states in this country, they will be able to go to a service center, a healing center, and have an experience that falls outside of what we call the medical model. It's still highly regulated. In some ways, I think that the regulations that they're trying to put on at the state level are almost more granular than what we'll see in the medical model in some ways, simply because they don't have the preset controls that anything happening under a medical paradigm has. Like there is no HIPAA. There is a very murky relationship with, how all of that relates to federal law and the Controlled Substances Act. So it's kind of, in some ways, it feels like it's almost overcompensating. I think that in some ways, the medical model will provide a really expansive container, simply because how the psychotherapy is administered is going to come down to individual clinician discretion and judgment. There's going to be standards for that. And of course, there's going to be behavior that falls below the standard of care, and that leads to malpractice. But I think that there's going to be a whole universe of, okay, psychotherapy, what does that mean? It could mean all sorts of different things. And then of course there's sacramental religious use, there's decriminalized use. And I think that all of these things are really valid and really important. And to me, the most important thing is that we have all the different access pathways. They're being parallel pathed. No, nothing's more important than the other. All of them are safe. And we are over communicating all the time to both, practitioners, facilitators, as well as patients, clients, participants about what they're doing, what they can expect, what this is, what this isn't. So there can actually be informed consent. You can't consent to something you don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to talk too about, what APPA is doing in terms of focusing on diversity and inclusion. I know that's a big point of emphasis here amongst a lot of different organizations and professionals within this psychedelic community right now. Can you speak to any of what those objectives might be?
So, given my experience sitting on various boards that deal with things like, how are we going to infuse equity and access into the psychedelic space? My response to that question is actually pretty boring, because what I've learned in those from those experiences is that a lot of it just comes down to insurance.
Yeah.
Um, like that's kind of like the threshold issue, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how diverse your workforce is, or how culturally sensitive your training or your care is, if people from lower socioeconomic populations can't access your services. Like, it just doesn't matter. Like, it's all for show if it's not that. And not to say those things are all really, really important, but that's like the second step.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's that. And then I think, culturally competent care is really important. I think it's really confusing and really tricky. And I actually think we don't really know enough to say what that looks like. I mean, I think what I hear talking to practitioners is that the most important thing in their personal experience, and also like according to the literature, the most important thing that makes therapy effective is trust and good rapport between the patient and the practitioner. And so I think that insofar as cultural competency and training on those issues is necessary for the development of trust and good rapport in the therapeutic container, I think that's really, really important. And I think when we put together guidelines, there's a real need for some conversation around, health equity in
Mhm.
terms of practice, for sure, and what that looks like.
Yeah, I want to wrap, things up by just, talking a little bit about it's semi-adjacent. It's in the cannabis space. Recently, there's been some conversations about the rescheduling or reclassifying of cannabis from Schedule 1 to potentially Schedule 3. That seems to be some really big news finally coming out of the cannabis space. And I've had people in the psychedelics, sector sort of reaching out and asking me, is that at all something that might, sort of demonstrate where things could potentially go with psychedelics? And so I'm curious from your perspective and spending as much time as you spend, working with policymakers, does what's happening in cannabis and that progress or potential progress, does that signal at all what might happen in the psychedelic space?
I think that the two are related, and I think rescheduling will have bearing on what happens with psychedelics, because I think it's almost like, I think the federal government needed to get cannabis a little bit out of the way before turning their focus to us.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's like probably the biggest connection I see between the two ultimately. Um, Rescheduling of psychedelics, like, as far as we know right now, like, current projections based on what's happening on the ground will be a result of or adjacent to FDA approvals. So if and when FDA approves MDMA, for example, they will give their findings to DEA. DEA will then have, I think it's 90 days to decide where they're going to put MDMA, because if it is proven to have unaccepted medical use, it'll no longer be eligible for Schedule 1. So it's going to happen in a very different way. I think we could get into like the politics of where things are at with the White House right now, but that's a little bit more speculative.
Yeah, kind of tough to say where things might go. But I know, folks out there, they see that, and many people think there's no way that psychedelics will ever be reclassified or rescheduled. And so, I think that this has offered just a little bit of hope that maybe, that there is a pathway for that happening. So I appreciate you answering that to the best you could there. And definitely appreciate everything that you continue to do and the work that you're putting in here and really laying a very important foundation for this growing sector of psychedelic assisted therapy. Again, I cannot overstate how important the training and ensuring that practitioners who are at the front lines of all of this, how important all of that work is. So thank you so much, Hadas. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was really fun, and thank you for all of the work you're doing and the information you're getting out there. It's really important.
Yeah, we enjoy it. We love it. I want to encourage everyone out there, please, to look up APPA. It's APPA-US.org. We'll also get that linked into this podcast as well. But Hadas, again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David.